Welcome back to The Tea with me, Myriam Francois, where we discuss the story behind the stories and flip the script on current affairs with real talk, real people, and real discussions. So, let's spill the tea. This week, I want to talk about a highly sensitive subject, anti-Semitism. In the midst of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, we've seen widespread attempts to silence critics of Israel by smearing them as anti-Semitic, from Oscar-winning Jewish-Israeli director Yuval Abraham to climate activist Greta Thunberg, through to civil rights legend and scholar Angela Davis. It's fairly clear today that the term is being weaponized. But by whom exactly? And what is at stake in the increasingly fraught arguments over what is or is not anti-Semitism? Joining us to try and unpick some of these issues is award-winning journalist and author of Off-White, The Truth About Antisemitism, Rachel Shabi. Rachel's work has appeared in publications like The Guardian, The New York Times, and The Independent, and she has reported extensively on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Rachel, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here with us. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on.
I wanted to ask you about the last 15 months. It's been a horrific year for many people all around the world, particularly, of course, those in Gaza. And I wanted to ask you about how it's been for you as someone who I know has spoken out against what's happening in Gaza, but is also Jewish, was born in Israel. How have the last 15 months been for you?
Absolutely horrifying. Everybody is losing their minds over the images that we're watching on our screens for over a year now of this apocalyptic war without end. Every day we wake up to another slaughter, another atrocity, now not just in Gaza but also in Lebanon. So it's been world-changing, I think, in ways that we don't possibly yet know. This horrifying bombardment and decimation of Gaza. But it's also, I think, hard to truly grasp the enormity of it. Because what we're seeing is very, very hard for us to put into words. It's very hard for us to comprehend just the scale of the bombardment, of the decimation, of the terrorizing experience that Palestinians in Gaza are experiencing every single day for over a year.
And I wanted to ask you about polarization, which we know has been much talked about. You reference in your book, Naomi Klein, talking about kind of the normalization of polarization in the way that we talk about almost any issue actually today. And I know from when I post, for example, on social media, if I ever make any equivalence in terms of the sacredness of human life and the loss of human life, whether Israeli or Palestinian, that I tend to get a lot of pushback against that. Not everyone. I think there's a growing number of people who are kind of tired actually of that. But I do feel the polarization. I do feel the pressure to sort of almost pick a side. Have you felt like you've been polarized or been pushed to choose the side?
Well, the first thing to say about that, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And we have to also acknowledge that what's happened has itself been polarizing. And people have been radicalized, for want of a better word, in either direction. So the poles are even more polarized. One of the things that made that surreally clear to me was I posted on Twitter, now X, I'm just going to keep calling it Twitter, at some point, something like civilians are civilians, it doesn't matter where. And what happened was that either side, pro-Palestinian or pro-right-wing Israeli, took offense with that. So either side had decided who that was being referenced as civilians, as opposed to just acknowledging the universality of a statement that civilians are civilians. That in itself became read through each person's particular silo and political filter. So that to me was a statement as writ large as any of what we're looking at. But I think you're also right that people are getting fed up of that. People really are getting tired of that. And I get the sense that outside of, this sort of shouty polarization, what we're seeing is likely a quieter collective of people that are trying to find a different way to narrate this experience, and certainly a more inclusive way of doing so.
Yeah, there's somebody that I follow on X, Twitter, of course, who says something repeatedly along that vein. He says, look, eventually we are all just going to have to find a way to live together. I mean, after everything will be said and done, that is where this is going to end. And so, I think he's sort of encouraging people to think carefully about how we talk now, because whatever we say now will impact how quickly we're able to get to that place. Mm-hmm. You, like I have, spent some time in Israel and Palestine as an adult. I mean, you were born in Israel, but you didn't spend much time there as a child, if I understand correctly. How did the experience of going there as an adult affect you? Because for me, it was completely life-changing. For me, it was, seeing sort of apartheid up close. It really changed me forever. I was wondering what your experience was like.
I was very lucky in that I got to spend a lot of time in that region, in Israel, Palestine, and I was able to, speak with people everywhere, and people with long histories would talk to me about their experiences, and it was just a giant learning experience for me, which I will always consider myself fortunate to have had. And you're absolutely right that once you see in the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem the realities, this is what a military occupation looks like. This is what it looks like every single day. This is the daily violence. This is the daily dehumanization. This is the daily stifling of anything that one would consider a regular human life. Once you see that up close, yes, it does clearly look like an apartheid structure. And yes, it is impossible to forget.
You mentioned the sense of being othered in the UK as an Iraqi-Jewish person who'd been born in Israel. And I wanted to ask you about that. What was your life growing up? Where did you grow up? How did you feel about your identity? Did you feel like an Arab Jew, as some of my friends do? Or did you feel that that was a category error, like you mentioned? I mean, how did you self-define or come to understand your identity?
Growing up, I was surrounded by, my parents showed up as Iraqi Jews, but also as Israelis. And so the culture was steeped in both. They spoke between them Arabic. However, we were raised to speak English and integrate and all of those things that, a good migrant does, which we did. And, I learned to speak like this. But I was aware that, my parents were immersed in this very rich heritage that, growing up, I was embarrassed about, or perhaps I'd internalized the inferiority that with which that culture was assessed in the UK. And so it took me a while to really sort of claim that as my own and actually claim all of those hyphens as my own. And I think that in common with a lot of migrant generations, I look back with a little bit of sadness and shame at having, as a child, been quite dismissive of my parents and, the rich cultural heritage and intellectual heritage that they brought. I do feel sad about growing up somewhat dismissive of that.
And I wanted to ask you about their experience of migration to Israel. One of my former professors from Oxford, Professor Avi Shleim, is also Iraqi Jewish heritage, Israeli, and he talks about how his family in Iraq had a very kind of esteemed reputation and standing in Iraq. And then when he arrived in Israel, of be experiencing, I guess, racism, of being treated. So you've alluded to this, of course, in your answer earlier, of being treated sort of like second-class citizens. And that was when he says he realized that the Israeli project, was a project of whiteness. And that's what he describes it as. Steeped, I think he says, in structural, in whiteness. What was your family's experience of moving to Israel? Because for many people, it was sort of a promise of something, and maybe, certainly in Professor Schleim's experience, it didn't quite deliver on what they were expecting.
Well, Professor Schleim will probably have the same reference points in the sense that, for Iraqi Jews, it wasn't necessarily a promise, in the sense that, at that time, basically what we saw was the collapse of a hyphenated identity. So Iraqi Jews, much like Moroccan Jews, much like, Jews across North Africa and the Middle East, competing nationalisms essentially collapse that hyphen of, you say you're Arab Jew, but you got to pick a side now, because, the nationalisms are polarizing and actually set against each other. And so that hyphen became an impossibility. But actually at that time, so late 40s, early 50s, Iraqi Jews were not predominantly Zionist. They weren't Jewish nationalists. They were predominantly Iraqi nationalists. And so there was a mass exodus to Israel from Iraq in 51, but they weren't necessarily arriving in the same way and with the same expectation that one might say of European Jews who were fleeing, the horrors of the Holocaust, but actually hundreds and hundreds of years of relentless persecution. But arriving in Israel, and this is the subject of my first book, I do look at how, all those Jews from Middle Eastern countries who, as you say, arrived with some standing in those previous countries, whether that might be cultural or economic. I interview the Kuwaiti brothers who are, were very esteemed Iraqi musicians, Iraqi Jewish musicians, just celebrated, lauded, and then arrived in Israel and end up running a store because there is just no capacity to appraise as valuable Oriental music. It just doesn't sound like culture to a Europe-trained ear at that time. Although now, one has to say, you will hear, Kulthum into Omri, like across Israel-Palestine. So, things have changed. But the whole book is really an examination of how and why that erasure of Arab culture from the Jewish population from the Middle East happened. And it was because Israel was conceived as a European project. It was forged as a result of European racism. And it was also forged in the ambience of European nationalism, which was imbued with a superiority complex. And so all of those things, I think another important factor is that European Jews who were told for hundreds and hundreds of years, you guys are not European. You guys are other. You're the demonized other. You're Oriental, you're Asiatic, you're all the negative stereotypes we'll attribute to you. I can imagine that those European Jews arriving in Israel might say, no, actually we are European, right? That might be a reaction as well. But all of those things were in the mix. And the end result was that, Jews from the Middle East did have ended up as this sort of socioeconomic inferior class in Israel.
You say that you sort of have ended up writing a book about anti-Semitism almost begrudgingly, I guess, if it's fair to say, right? This is, as you say, is not your patch. You have written about so many other issues, but you felt, I guess, compelled at this time to write this book. And in it, you describe how progressives either avoid the conversation around anti-Semitism or struggle to engage effectively. Why do you think that it is so difficult to talk about anti-Semitism?
I think there's lots of different reasons, and some of them are contradictory. And so the reason I wrote this book was because I wanted to just untangle that knot so that we can look at, okay, there are separate and distinct reasons, and sometimes they contradict each other, but they are separate and distinct reasons why this conversation has become such a dumpster fire, right? It's throwing more shade than light. There is less understanding of anti-Semitism as a product of this horrendous conversation that's dominating our political and media mainstream. And so I think researching the book, I was able to identify quite distinct factors. So we can talk about the way that fake claims of anti-Semitism are used to shut down not just Palestinian voices and Palestinian advocacy, but actually far more wider ranging, Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, diversity and equity programs. You know, it's become a much more broad spectrum attack. And at the same time, we look at how pro-Israel anti-Semitism has developed and seems to be given a pass to the extent that you can be as anti-Semitic as you like, as long as you're pro-Israel. And then at the same time, the way that we as progressive anti-racists construct our understanding of anti-racism is along a black-white binary, which doesn't actually factor in either the experiences or the specificity of Jewish people and anti-Semitism. So we need to sort of not ditch that, because we need to understand whiteness as upholding the structures of racism, but we also need to add a bit or expand it so that it can encompass the experiences of anti-Semitism.
I mean, last night I watched a British doctor who was giving testimony in Parliament, describing how after, you know, a bombing, there were injured children lying on the ground and drones coming along and shooting these injured children. And I mean, he was on the verge of tears. We know the siege of northern Gaza, starvation, the kind of mass destruction. I mean, and of course, the ongoing now plans to annex the West Bank. In the midst of all of this, is it appropriate to have the conversation about anti-Semitism right now?
Well, there's a few things to say about that. I mean, first of all, that would imply that one has to stop doing one thing in order to do the other. And I think we can agree that no one is suggesting we stop our necessary and urgent efforts to halt the killing machine in Gaza. That's not the suggestion. That kind of thinking is very much a product of our, you know, the world that we live in, which is a zero-sum world, right? It's a very sort of far-right appraisal of the world that actually has percolated into all our thinking, which is either or, as though there isn't enough racism to go around, as though we can only talk about one form of it because otherwise we'd not be able to talk about the other. You know, so I'm not suggesting that we stop doing what we're doing. I'm suggesting that we add this component. And actually, the last year has made clear that in many ways it's never been more urgent, not just because we're seeing in overdrive the way that claims of anti-Semitism are used to shut down anyone just crying out for a ceasefire or to stop this slaughter. And as you said, whether it's, you know, Jewish voices, Israeli Jewish voices, you know, climate campaigners, the UN, you know, it's gone into overdrive. And at the same time, we have seen a surge in anti-Semitism globally. We are talking about physical and verbal assaults. We are talking about vandalism of Jewish buildings around the world. And that's before we get to the hate that's spewing online that you and I have both seen. And at the same time, we've seen the far right essentially make hay with this political moment. We've seen the way that the far right might latch onto the Palestine movement, opportunistically pretending to support the Palestine cause, and then mainline the most virulent anti-Semitism. So all of these things have been happening in this last year, making it an even more urgent conversation.
A significant portion of the controversy and I guess polarization over allegations of anti-Semitism lie in some pro-Israeli voices dubbing anyone who opposes Zionism as anti-Semitic. And in fact, I was seeing Intelligence Squared did a whole debate literally titled, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? What do you say to those who have made the case that this is an equation that must be made, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism?
I would say straightforwardly, no. Not always. It is actually impossible, unreasonable, and unfair to say that all criticism of anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitic. And we've got historical examples, even amongst historical and contemporary examples amongst Jews themselves, who would self-describe as opposed to Zionism. The trouble is that the progressive left, tends to take the inverse and opposite reaction to what the right wing is doing, right? Just as a dynamic that we see manifest across various political issues. Or if the right says one thing, then I'm going to say the opposite. We cannot say that anti-Zionism is never anti-Semitic. We cannot say that.
Of course.
And so our responsibility as the progressive left that wants to fight for justice for Palestinians has to be to rigorously be conducting these audits to ensure, to do this sort of anti-racist hygiene checks, to ensure that our movements are not saturated with anti-Semitism, because one can lead to the other, but one is not conclusively evidence of the other.
And are there any particular things that you would say the left should be attentive to in how that manifests in discourse that, say, is opposing what's happening in Palestine or in the anti-Zionist movement? Particular flashpoints that you'd be like, okay, just be aware of this.
Well, I'm sure you, much like I, have, because I assume that our silos at some point overlap. We have seen really virulent, rampant anti-Semitism pop up in the pro-Palestine sphere online. And a lot of that is actually to do with conspiratorial thinking about Jewish power, Jewish control, right, of whatever it is, media, politics, whatever it is. And so, we definitely need to be better informed and better educated as to what anti-Semitism is, which is essentially a conspiracy about power, right? That's its heart. It's the elevation of certain people amongst that racialized minority, giving them enough power and status that they can then be used as a punch bag by rulers when things go wrong. Historically, that's its origin story, and through the centuries, we can see that being deployed, and that's why we get Jewish people accused of contradictory things, like, oh, you're poor and dirty and awful, but also you're a rich elite. You're responsible for communism, but also you're responsible for capitalism. That's why it's so wide-ranging, because it's a conspiracy about power. And I would say that especially in the last year, we do need to be really rigorous about that, because, with the US, as you know, Palestinians will refer to this as a US-Israeli war or assault on Gaza and Lebanon. But we've got US leaders up to and including Joe Biden say for the last year, oh, I'm trying to stop them. I'm trying to stop Israel. I keep talking to the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm getting more and more annoyed with him. He just won't listen. And it's like, that in itself is fueling conspiracism in our ecosystem, because then people will wonder, well, why? Why can't the most powerful man in the world stop what is essentially a client state that is backed militarily and diplomatically by the US? And so, we need to be rigorously rejecting that and understanding what Israel is in geopolitical terms, how and why it operates as a client state for the US, that it's a foothold in the Middle East, that there's all kinds of arrangements that the US establishment, rightly or wrongly, views as advantageous, strategically advantageous to the US, militarily, security, intelligence, all of it. So that appraisal of the geopolitics of it will help us deconstruct the conspiracism that actually we're seeing flood sections of social media at the moment.
It's really interesting you raised that specific example of Joe Biden kind of in his charade of not being able to stop Israel, because I've called that out repeatedly online and said, this, for me, this is a US war and Israel is enacting what has been agreed. It's clearly something they both agree on. I think the idea that the US objects to this in any way based on the last year is not only fictitious, but it's deceitful to suggest that there's anything other than a consensus on this, clearly. I was listening to the audiobook by Julia Neuberger on anti-Semitism. I don't know if you've come across it, but she sort of refers to two of the main tropes. One of them you just referred to, the idea that Jews control the world, and then the idea of dual loyalty. And then I was thinking about how so many of the issues that are being talked about today with regards to Israel seem to confirm these tropes in many ways. So, this idea that Jews control the world, well, of course, people will point to what you just said and claim that, Joe Biden is basically taking orders from Netanyahu. I think that's clearly false. I think it's a misunderstanding of the relationship. And I think that's what you were also alluding to. But there's also a load of things that do fuel this, right? So the delay on the ICC arrest warrants by Karim Khan, he suggested that there's been sort of systematic obstruction from Israel and its allies in the investigation process. Then we've seen the sacking of these journalists who've had the audacity of confronting Israeli officials on air, Sangita Misker at LBC, Beldonati at Sky. And then the editorial meddling, of course, that we've then seen in reports like those of the Maccabi Tel Aviv incident. We've got the BBC and the Robbie Gibbs scandal, where the editor of the anonymously funded Jewish Chronicle, which published, as you well know, the fabricated stories that even the IDF denied, is on the board of the editorial decisions around Middle East coverage at the BBC, which I think pretty much everyone agrees is really shocking at this point. And I'm asking genuinely, how do you respond to that? Because I can see how that can fuel anti-Semitic tropes, but it's also a list of things that we are seeing. I wouldn't say Jewish people, but I would say Israeli and pro-Israeli people clearly doing.
As we saw with, the current assault on Gaza, there is an alignment of interest between the US and Israel and other allies. And thus it is the case with other instances across the board. It doesn't need someone specific to be doing or not doing something for there to be an alignment of interest that's going in a particular direction. I can give you one of the things that I talk about in my book when I look at the far right. One component of that is obviously the relationships that the right-wing expansionist Netanyahu government has been making with pro-Israel authoritarians across Eastern Europe. Orban is the classic example, Hungary's Viktor Orban. But the other element of that is making friends with and currying favor and being aligned with Christian evangelists, Christian Zionists.
Yeah.
Now, we as the progressive left spend a lot of our time looking at AIPAC,
yes,
which is the American Israel lobby in the US. And it's, of course, we need to do that. Of course we do, because on the Democratic side, it does. It's very good as a lobby. It's very good at changing the composition of the Democratic Party by campaigning, sometimes with Republican funds, to oust Democratic candidates that it sees as insufficiently pro-Israel, which, it defines on its own terms. Now, yes, it's important to call that out. Yes, what we're calling out, actually, is the undue influence of political lobbying in the US system. That's what we're calling out. We're calling out a structure in the US that allows politics to be bought by lobbies, whether that's a pro-Israel lobby, whether that's a farmer lobby, whether that's a gun control lobby, right? That's what we're calling out, and we should not lose sight of that. But the other element of it is in our focus on AIPAC, because it's part of the progressive frame of things, we completely overlook the influence of Christian Zionists in the US, who are bigger.
And more numerous, in fact.
I mean, there's between 80 to 100 million Christian evangelists in the US. There's 6 million Jewish people in the US, most of whom vote Democratic, most of whom poll in the same way that we would poll on issues around Israel-Palestine, right? And so, you don't have to listen to me saying that. The Israeli appraisal of it is the same thing. We had Ron Dermer, the former ambassador to Israel. At some point, he gave an interview to Israeli media, and he said, we need to be more focused on Christian evangelists. There's more of them, and they're more supportive. Objectively, they are more supportive of far-right expansionist Israeli aims than certainly the American Jewish community is. And so I think just on taking the time to untangle and thinking, hang on, where is the power? Who is it that's holding the power in this scenario? Might help to eliminate some of these conspiratorial patterns of thinking that we see people absorb and adopt. And it's worth saying that this conspiratorial thinking is just a part of our society. You know, it has saturated, anti-Semitism has saturated our societies for hundreds and hundreds of years, much like racism, much like Islamophobia. It would be fair to assume that it is also influencing our thoughts and our pathways. And so we do have to consciously do the work to make sure that's not happening.
So you mentioned, of course, the ways in which there is a sort of observation of the way in which politics is working across the board that's not specific, of course, to Israel or to Jewish communities. And in fact, some of the information, like Jews more likely to vote Democrat than sort of the kind of very well, although the Democrats were just as pro-Israel in this election than the Republicans were. But one of the other issues, I suppose, is this idea that there is not just a meddling by political institutions, but I guess the BBC is an example of somewhere where it's like, how is somebody who is clearly sort of politically aligned with Israel very openly allowed to have such influence on something as important as impartial coverage of the Middle East coverage? Or in the Sky News example, the editor in question, you know, I went through her Twitter feed, was full of sort of, you know, disparaging comments around the pro-Palestine demos and sort of calling out pro-Palestinian supporters. And I was thinking, I know this to be true, that as a Muslim journalist, and many of my colleagues face this, if you post anything vaguely pro-Palestinian on your feed, you will immediately get taken off the story. You are in many ways taken off any sort of reporting connected to the story. And there's often a massive backlash against journalists. I mean, one of my colleagues at one of the major networks, somebody saw her reporting around Israel-Palestine, saw that she was Muslim, she's a Muslim name, and went through her Twitter feed all the way to 2002 and found a picture of her in hijab and sort of tied it all together and made a formal complaint about her being the person reporting on this and, the suggestion that she couldn't possibly be objective. It does feel like there's a double standard at play even within the media, which is, a space where it's not this confluence of political interest, right? These are just individual journalists who in some cases seem to be doing the bidding of Israel, and they don't get held to the same standards that journalists of other backgrounds who might be, say, supportive of Palestine do when they weigh in on those issues.
But I think that what we need to do is look more widely at why this dynamic is happening. Why do we have the perception of a hierarchy, right? Which is essentially what you're asking me. Why is it that
double standards, I guess.
Double standards. We have a perception that claims of anti-Semitism are given more weight, more conversation. The political and media narrative engages with that a lot more than it does.
Do you think that's true?
I think that they absolutely do. Yeah. So why is that happening? Right? And it's not because there's a Jewish conspiracy, right? Of course. So that's the sort of thinking that it lends itself to.
Yeah.
It lends itself to that because we are saturated in a media environment, in a social environment in which the architecture of anti-Semitism is ever present.
So I completely accept that.
Okay.
I just don't know how to
So let's look at it.
Yes.
Let's look at it and offer an alternative.
Yes, exactly.
And so what we have is, Jewish people, what we need to ask is, what is this serving? Okay? So first of all, we can objectively say that sometimes it's not just the case that Islamophobia and anti-Black racism isn't being prioritized. It's also the case that it's being reproduced in our political and media conversations, right? We need to straightforwardly identify that. Baroness Said of Arsi saying it's past the dinner table test, Islamophobia. Right. It's being reproduced in these very same media and political circles, right? But the second thing is, what is it that the narrative of supposedly tackling anti-Semitism, what is it that it offers to Western countries and how they perceive themselves, right? And so we can see that post-Holocaust, post the Second World War, where obviously that happened and Western countries did nothing to prevent it from happening, and worse, closed their borders to Jewish refugees who were desperately trying to escape the clutches of the Third Reich. All of those countries had to rehabilitate themselves after the Holocaust, right? They had to be able to find a redemption story in that whole experience. And so the redemption story is Jewish people are absorbed into whiteness. We're going to create this Judeo-Christian narrative, which is not a thing, but we're going to start talking about Judeo-Christian values up to and including Germany, which is quite the statement when you think about it. Yep. We're going to talk about fighting Hitler and fighting anti-Semitism because that allows us to rehabilitate ourselves in a redemptive narrative as the good guys. That narrative is not available in the story of Islamophobia. It's not available in the story of slavery. It's not available in the story of empire. And
it's a ticket out. It's a ticket out for them, is what you're saying.
Well, I'm saying that it's much more, it gives much more to those Western countries. Yes, it throws Jewish people a bone in that they say they're fighting anti-Semitism. They're not. Right?
Yeah.
But it's more about Western self-image. It's the availability of a redemption narrative. And we see that in the way, so I give an example in the UK of the way there's so much more political time and political funding invested in the idea of a Holocaust memorial, where British Jews across the board will say, we probably don't need one, we already have one. And some British Jews will say, okay, but if you're going to do a Holocaust memorial, can you talk about Britain's role in anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
Right? Can you talk about how the roots of colonialism and anti-Semitism in the UK are actually intertwined? Right? But that is given priority over the idea of having a slavery memorial, which repeatedly has failed to get the funding that it deserves.
Right.
And so we can see right there the prioritizing of a memorial for the Holocaust because it reflects a particular British self-image that isn't available in a slavery memorial.
Yeah, it kind of protects the self-image that, and we know governments do this all the time, that they want to project about themselves. That's really interesting. I appreciate that because I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. I wanted to ask you about the other big anti-Semitic trope that Julia Neuberger references in the book, which is one that we get lauded with all the time as Muslims, which is this idea of dual loyalty. As you know, we've seen this questioned many times. It came up, of course, a lot through ISIS. Yeah. We know, Sam Shank, a British-born IDF soldier, estimates that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of fellow Brits that are currently serving in the IDF. How can the British Jewish community tackle these tropes when so many, and not just them, all of us together is the point, when so many British and other European citizens are technically serving in a foreign army, in this case, the Israeli army, whose actions the majority of people oppose. And if we were going to use the government's language, is against British values, is against human rights. Does this, does in fact what Israel calls Jewish Israeli citizens to do not fuel the trope that there is a dual allegiance?
So those are British Israelis. They have dual citizenship, one would assume.
Yes, that's okay. Those are the hundreds to thousands that he's referencing are dual British Israeli.
So they
citizens.
are actually also Israeli citizens.
Yeah, and they serve in the IDF, and then they come back, and some of them are actually serving in Gaza now and returning to the UK and currently not being prosecuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to make clear that they're not. They actually do have dual citizenship.
Yes, of course. Okay. Yeah.
So I think what we're asking people to do objectively is a lot. We're asking people to, at the same time, both understand that Jewish people outside of Israel, and we're talking about, a tiny population globally, right? That gets all this undue attention, right? We're talking about not very many people, under 10 million outside of Israel. We're asking people not to blame them for the actions of the Israeli government, even when the Israeli government speaks in their name, right? Which I think that's probably the easier one, because the British government does lots of things in my name that I will oppose completely. I did not support the Iraq war, for instance. I'm still angry about that.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably an easier one to get our heads around, that people who do not live and do not vote in a country cannot be blamed for the actions of that country when we're talking about Israel and diasporic Jews. But we're also asking at the same time people to understand that Jewish people do have a complex relationship to Israel, right? That for many Jewish people, now this wasn't my personal experience, but for many Jewish people, they were raised in communities outside of Israel where Israel is part of their Jewish identity, right? That's how they were raised.
That's often built into the narrative of Jewishness in this country, isn't it? The sort of, my son went to a Jewish nursery, and the Israeli flags were everywhere. I mean, they would color them in, and I was a little shocked, because for me, I don't make the automatic assumption of Jewishness equals Israel. Maybe because I know a lot of Jews who are very critical of Israel and probably would be very upset if their kids were coloring in Israeli flags in preschool. But yes, so what you're saying is, but that's very common, right?
Yeah. I mean, I interviewed lots of people that would actually say something quite similar to describe, going to school with that kind of experience in Britain, also in the US. And at the same time as saying that, we're also asking people to accept that that's not uniform.
Yeah.
That lots of Jewish people don't have that experience, that actually do not have any relationship to Israel. Like, the British comedian David Baddiel, right? He would have said up until recently, I do not relate to this in any way.
Yeah.
Lots of Jewish people outside of Israel would self-define as anti-Zionist, would self-define as diasporists, meaning that they've built their identity out as Jews outside of Israel. Yeah. And then there's a whole bunch of people for whom it's complicated because, and this is something that other people have written about, that, the last year and a bit has forced a reckoning of, okay, but some people are still tied to this place, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whether it's an attachment to a Jewish collective or a Jewish nationhood. There's all kinds of different reasons.
Yeah.
But we cannot automatically assume that all of those things equals support for a murderous ethno-nationalist state.
Completely.
And I think that a lot of people do make that assumption. Yeah. Right? And that's where we get into difficulty when we want to build a wider, inclusive movement where progressive Jewish leftists can show up. That's where we run into complications, that we don't actually facilitate these kind of conversations that can get to the heart of what is it that people are actually saying when they're talking about these things.
The French Jewish journalist Sylvain Sibel recently made the case in a TV debate that, and this is what he said, that just as ISIS had fueled Islamophobia, Israel today is fueling anti-Semitism. And it got me thinking a little bit about the analogy, which of course caused a lot of discussion on the show, that, as a Muslim, I feel quite strongly about distancing myself and my faith publicly from anything that ISIS does. I mean, I don't think that I should have to spend my entire career doing that, but if it's
every day,
right
before breakfast,
indeed. But if it's raised, yes, I absolutely want to be clear. This is a horrifically deformed understanding of our faith, which does a massive disservice to the values of our faith. Do you think it's incumbent on Jews, as many are doing actually today, to be fair, to distance themselves from Israel in a similar way? Not that they should have to, because I don't think even Muslims should have to. But do you think, given the horrors of what are going on and the fact that Israel claims to be speaking in the name of Jews and be doing it in the name of Jews, that it would be easier to distinguish, the kind of what Israel is versus the Jewish community that may or may not support it, whereas there's a clear attempt by Israel to conflate them?
I mean, I'll be honest and say, to me, that sounds like a litmus test that doesn't actually build the inclusive, anti-racist, speaking up for Palestinian justice and rights movement that we want to build. And the reason I think that is because one cannot compare Israel, that was created and succeeded in its aim because of European racism and anti-Semitism. That is the origin story of Israel. One cannot compare that to anything else that one might compare it to, as you have just done. I mean, the whole point about Israel is that it is both a settler-colonial project and a national project. And we can't reject either of those, right? They are both part of the same story. That's why Edward Said, the Palestinian intellectual, talked about Palestinians as victims of the victims, refugees of the refugees. The Palestinian philosopher Raif Zreik writes about this very well also currently. And so, the idea that you would just slice off the reality that for many Jewish people, Israel also represents a national project. They might also be screaming out with you to stop this apocalyptic war. They might be. You don't know that. And so appraising them through that narrow litmus test that you have subjected, first of all, is going to alienate a lot of Jewish people. Secondly, I don't think is fair. And thirdly, if your objective is to build an inclusive anti-racist movement, you're going to fail. I would also encourage people to look at, one of the big problems with this conversation about anti-Semitism is that we are always in reaction to, right? We are caught in this political media storm, and we're constantly reacting to accusations, reacting to what Israeli leaders and supporters are saying, reacting to what Western politicians are saying in support of it. We're always reacting. And I guess the question is, what can we do in this narrative that actually is our own? What do we generate in this narrative? And I'm reminded of Mehdi Hassan, who wrote the book How to Win Every Argument, the broadcaster and journalist who, one has to admit, does win most arguments in broadcast TV. And so his book, he talks a lot about the necessity in winning arguments to establish your own credibility. What's your credibility and trustworthiness to be talking about a particular subject? If all we are doing in the arena of anti-Semitism is saying that claim of anti-Semitism is fake, and by the way, Israel is doing this, and this, where is our credibility to actually talk about the anti-Semitism? Where is our trustworthiness to actually talk about anti-Semitism if all we're doing is rebutting, rejecting, and actually blaming someone else for it? You know, so I would encourage us to think about a more constructive and inclusive way of talking about anti-Semitism that isn't always in reaction to this storm of forces that we see in our media and political conversation, because only then are we going to be able to build a genuinely coherent and inclusive anti-racist movement.
So I completely hear you on that. I guess because the house is on fire right now, you know, and I mean the house on fire being Gaza, that there is a sense that, you know, the Jewish consent, the perceived Jewish consent for what Israel is doing, which is manipulated by the government to provide cover for what they're doing, right? It's the idea, well, we are protecting the Jewish state. You know, this is the only place that Jews can be safe in the world. This entire narrative that's constructed to sort of protect Israel from the forms of accountability that we would expect to see for any other state. I suppose, to me, it feels very urgent right now for that respectability that is afforded to Israel in the name of the Jewish community to be dismantled.
Do you think if, you know, the less than 10 million Jews that exist outside of Israel stopped supporting, or that the percentage that do support Israel, do you think if they stopped supporting the war that we're currently seeing, the decimation of Gaza that we're suddenly seeing, if the Jews that currently supported that outside of Israel stopped doing that, do you think it would change anything?
I think it would make a massive difference.
Why?
I think it would pull the rug of legitimacy away from what the government claims to be doing, which is protecting a community that has experienced horrors in recent history, and therefore we all have an emotional. Well, most people have an emotional response of yes, Jewish people need to be protected from any sort of repeat of what we feel, particularly Europeans, right? We grew up learning about the horrors that were done in our name. And I think if the majority of Jews were heard saying not in our name, which is of course what, you know, Jews for Justice do and Jewish Elders for Peace do, that's literally what they hold up signs saying, I think it would remove a lot of the power of the narrative that's being used to justify what's going. You and I both know that this isn't why it's happening, right? I mean, let's be honest, this is about geopolitics, it's about power, it's about access to resources ultimately. But I think, you know, dismantling the narrative, it's the same way I feel, I guess, about, and people do this to me regularly. They're like, well, as a Muslim, you know, do you condemn Saudi Arabia? And I'm like, yeah, I have no issues distancing myself from Saudi Arabia. I would be offended if anyone suggested that it would be beyond the pale to criticize Saudi Arabia because somehow that would be Islamophobic because they claim to, you know, hold the mantle of Muslim identity. I'm going to call BS on that immediately. You can criticize Saudi Arabia day and night. They do not represent me. They do not represent Muslims. And in fact, in many ways, I see their actions today as being converse to the values of my faith. And if anyone publicly, certainly anyone official, started to try and hold the line that was true, you know, was trying to hold the line that somehow they were speaking on behalf of all Muslims, I would be the first in line to be like, I'm calling BS on this.
Yeah, but I think, again, we're not really understanding the dynamics of, you know, Israel created after a racialized minority was persecuted to near extinction across Europe. We're not really understanding the dynamics of that and its repercussions into the decades, into the current day. The repercussions for Jewish people who might also be Jewish leftists, who might also be as opposed to what's happening as you are, if not more so, because they have skin in the game. And so I think we really need to engage with what it is that we're looking at when we're looking at Jewish people as a tiny racialized minority globally, and why it is that it's so important, seemingly, for you to ask that of a tiny racialized minority, when, as you just said, we both know that's not the reason why this is going on.
No, of course. I'm saying any horrors committed in the name of my religion by a state, I want to be super clear, that's not in my name. And I, you know, would hope that if I I can imagine that if the majority of Muslims were silent on that, then people would be like, oh God, this is what they believe.
What I look at in the book, in the chapter that looks at Israel-Palestine, is that I try and encourage us to just pan back and adopt a wider lens and a wider frame of analysis, so that, yes, we can look at Israel-Palestine that unquestionably is settler-colonial, and at the same time, unquestionably, is a national project when we're looking at the origins of Israel. But at the same time, so we need that. We need that structure. We need to identify what it is that we're looking at, which is an expansionist settler colonialism sitting next to a Jewish national project. But at the same time, the idea of panning our lens back wider so that we can see actually everyone who is in that Israel-Palestine region right now, Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, everyone, whether we're looking at having experienced the Nakba or the Holocaust or the uprooting of Arab Jews from the Middle East, everyone in that region is there to some extent and intersecting ways because of European racial thinking and colonialism. And panning back so that we can embrace that actually allows us to look at these different categories of people with a universal anti-racist light. And I think that's going to be far more effective for our anti-racist struggle, but also for our Palestine solidarity struggle.
The national project of the Israeli state is, in its essence, a European project, right? It's European Jews that begin that. I mean, it's not some kind of reaction to colonialism in the region. It's European Jews starting this project, steeped in itself in the sort of racial supremacist thinking that's dominant, and in many ways then replicating it in the region. I don't know how the sort of Jewish national project fits into an anti-colonial lens in the region, given that it was started as part of a colonial enterprise, right, under a colonial mandate.
That's a very partial understanding, I would say. I don't think that, I mean, there were various reasons why it got that support of the British mandate, and some of them are actually colonial reasons in the sense of Britain and the way it viewed both Jewish people and Palestinian people. So I would encourage factoring that into the equation. But also, I think what we're looking at is the capacity to have both a top-down and a bottom-up appraisal, right? So the top-down is absolutely Zionist leaders at the time of the genesis of that ideology were European and steeped in that European thinking and talked about it as a colonial project. Right. There's no question. At the same time, the people who actually ended up in Palestine and then the state of Israel, they didn't wake up one day and fancy doing a bit of colonialism, right? Their appearance in Israel is to do with fleeing persecution culminating in the Holocaust. That's what they're doing there. Mm-hmm. Are you going to call those people colonial because they did that? Like, that was the impetus, that was the ideology that created that circumstance.
Right.
But that wasn't their agency in that moment.
Right. I understand the agency. I think the difference is something that I'm very grateful to somebody I consider a dear friend, Professor Barnett Rubin, who's a Jewish academic, helped me understand this distinction between sort of Zionism as a sort of religious aspiration that didn't require settler colonialism and didn't require appropriating people's lands and didn't require, in fact, any of the infrastructure that colonialism offered it, which was to sort of ethnically cleanse people off the land and create this nation state. The Zionist aspiration for a return to Israel in the sort of biblical terms is something that never required the creation of a physical state, mm-hmm. nation state. Mm-hmm. And, he kind of encouraged me to think about Zionism as something that, of course, massively predated the state of Israel. But the distinction I'm making, therefore, in regards to this is that those people may have come in many cases because of some sort of aspiration. Although I know that early on
mostly they were fleeing persecution.
Absolutely. But they didn't require the creation of an ethno-nationalist state for that to happen. The Jewish population, so the indigenous Palestinian populations welcomed many of those refugees long before the creation of the state of Israel, right? And we know of stories, for example, of Palestinians who opened their homes up to Jews fleeing persecution in Europe. And when the state of Israel was created, tried to come back and take their homes and say, well, you now have a state, and that home was now handed over to the new arrivals. I think that's where I would say that I don't see how the story, the genesis story of the state of Israel as it currently exists can fit into an anti-colonial lens, other than, of course, the suggestion that it's part of, what the UN recognized, I think around the 1950s as being an example of an anti-colonial struggle, that, it's something that is in the continuity of a portion of history that is part of what many people think of history in the past tense, but is the final chapter of the sort of decolonial struggle. I mean, I take it that you don't share that.
I think we're talking about two completely different things.
Fine.
And, that whole conversation about the religious affinity with Israel is actually not the conversation that I'm having.
Sure.
What I'm saying is something quite different, which is if we pan back wide enough, we can see that all of those people currently in that region, Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, are in some way a product of European racial thinking and colonialism. Okay? I'm not saying all of those things at the same time. We can see different elements intersect at different moments. And so when we look at, I think objectively we can agree that Zionism, whatever its genesis and intent, would not have succeeded in its stated project were it not for the Holocaust, right? It just demographically would not have worked, right? I'm talking about European racial thought that underpinned the Holocaust, that underpinned centuries and centuries of persecution, that to the extent that even before the Holocaust and the Third Reich, you had European Jews thinking, okay, we need an escape route from this, and our escape route is Jewish nationalism. Now, was it possible to construct a Jewish nationalism that would have said, well, actually, Europe, we don't want to be part of this European racial thinking. We're going to create a nationalism in Israel-Palestine with other Semites, since that's what you think we are. And it's going to be anti-racist. Was it possible to build that at the time? Yes, that's not what transpired. But the origin story of Jewish nationalism is escape from European racial thinking.
Right.
That's how it happened.
That's what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's nicely tied in then to a question I had around the sort of, you touched on this earlier, the far-right support that we're seeing and these far-right connections between the Israeli government and far-right movements across the world. You mentioned in the book, of course, being concerned by the sort of resurgence of nativist movements and their impact on anti-Semitism. And it's a concern that I share. The more I dig into it, the more it's actually really shocking. And I don't think many people actually really realize the scope of this. Now, when you go to far-right marches, or at least when you watch them from afar here in the UK these days, you'll sometimes see Israeli flags at these marches, which I was really shocked about. I mean, these are movements that have a history of violent anti-Semitism. And so I started to look into it and these sort of the deliberate funding and the creation of alliances between Israel and these far-right movements. And One of the sort of standout events for me was the 19th of December 2010 delegation that saw some 30 leaders of the so-called European Alliance for Freedom, which comprises a series of parties which can only really be described as far-right, heading to Israel. I mean, amongst them are people who are nostalgic for the Third Reich, people who are full-on Holocaust deniers, and I'm just wondering, I mean, among them were people like Geert Wilders, who, was calling for the burning of well, actually, I think he did burn the Quran. And I was just thinking to myself, how is it possible that Israel is creating alliances with these deeply anti-Semitic movements? And is that not in itself fueling anti-Semitism? Because these guys, I mean, we often look at the far right mobs, the football hooligans and the guys in the streets, but these guys are in charge of governments. They're heads of states. They've got seats in the European Parliament. How come this isn't a way bigger scandal? And I guess, first of all, why is it happening? Why is Israel creating alliances and funding far-right anti-Semites across the world?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's got a complicated answer. And there is definitely a parallel with Israel making friends with the Christian Zionist movement, where, I remember interviewing Sarah Posner, who's an American journalist who's written extensively about Christian Zionism. And she would talk about how she would interview various Jewish Americans or Israelis that would turn up to conferences or APAC conference where Christian Zionists were given keynote speeches, and she'd say, why are you friends with these guys? These guys are not friends of Jews. Their vision of the end times does not end well for Jewish people.
Yeah.
And she was told constantly, and that first of all, that end times prophecy, we don't really believe in that. Jewish people would be like, that's not how it's going to end. There's this joke around it that is, when Christ turns up on planet Earth, we can ask him if it's his first or second coming, right? It's like, we don't actually believe that's a thing. Yeah. But secondly, and more importantly for our purposes, they'll say, oh, well, Israel needs all the friends it can get. Now, one might suggest that Israel would have more friends on the international stage if it wasn't a serial violator of international law, if it didn't occupy, oppress and subjugate Palestinian people, and if it wasn't currently engaged in mass killing in Gaza and Lebanon. One might argue that, but that isn't a conversation that Israel is having. So instead, and the best illustration of this is what happened between Benjamin Netanyahu and Viktor Orban, the far-right Hungarian prime minister, very authoritarian. They got together in the early 2000s the first time. At that time, some 10 countries were newly joining the European Union. At that time, the European Union was very critical of Israel because at that time we had settlements expansion, we had the construction of the illegal separation wall, we had the siege of West Bank, occupied West Bank cities in the aftermath of the Second Intifada. We had lots of reasons for the European Union to be full of criticism and condemnation of Israel, legitimate reasons. But Netanyahu looked at this and looked at the newly arriving European countries and thought, well, maybe they can give Israel political support, which actually is exactly what came to pass. If you look at countries like Hungary and the Czech Republic, they are routinely supporting Israel and blocking bills in the EU, whether it comes to accurately labeling Israeli goods as coming from settlements in the occupied West Bank, or calling for a ceasefire more recently in the last year in Gaza. And so it's a win-win relationship for both of them. So Israel with under the far right, which is what it now is, Israel gets this cover at the EU level. Viktor Orban and others like him get rehabilitation. So they get to sanitize their image. They get to say, we're not anti-Semitic. Look, here's a picture of me shaking hands with Netanyahu. How can I possibly be anti-Semitic? They get to rehabilitate themselves and thereby mainline their main current hatred, which is Islamophobia and bashing Muslims. So they get to sanitize their self-image by pretending to be concerned with anti-Semitism, which they're not, and with ostentatious support for Israel. And at the same time, that allows them to be Islamophobic and to mainline anti-Muslim hatred. So it's a win for them. It's a win for Israel. It's not a win for Jewish communities across Europe. So, for instance, Hungarian Jews, at the time when this friendship between Orban and Netanyahu was developing, Viktor Orban ran a nakedly anti-Semitic election campaign, nakedly demonizing the Jewish billionaire philanthropist George Soros in quite overtly, legibly anti-Semitic terms. And the Jewish community at that time complained and said, look, responsible leadership requires calling this out. So it's not great news for them, but it does explain that alliance. It is win-win for the actual political leaderships, authoritarian, nativist political leaderships involved.
With all we've discussed on the show today, obviously this fueling of the far right, which I think it's fair to say, like you've just mentioned, that for all its intents and purposes of sort of being post-anti-Semitic, it's a farce. We know that these are deeply racist people, that their current target may well be Muslims, but never far behind that is usually anti-Semitism and other forms of minority hatred. If you put this together, so Israel sort of funding and fueling and rehabilitating these far-right movements across the world, fueling a war in Gaza, which is sort of undermining the entire system of international law, sullying the Jewish reputation by claiming to do this in the name of Jews when it doesn't speak for all Jews. Is it not the case today that Israel is massively fueling anti-Semitism?
Look, if Israel didn't exist, you would still have anti-Semitism.
Of course.
Right? I think the question for us is not who can we blame, right? The question for us is what can we do as anti-racists in this sphere? In this sphere that has been turned into, it's made incomprehensible, illegible, turned into a hellscape because of the combination of fake claims of anti-Semitism, pro-Israel, right-wing anti-Semitism, and progressive blind spots over anti-Semitism. What is our role in this? What is our role if we want to reconnect anti-Semitism to our ongoing struggle against all forms of racism? What does that look like? I think that's a much more important and valuable question for us today.
Then holding Israel accountable for its part in, rehabilitating anti-Semitic governments, not just individuals who have far less power. These are global networks that are created, 30 countries coming together.
I'm not saying don't call that out. I'm just saying that dynamic of, actually Saeed Avasi talked about this dynamic as it relates to Islamophobia. So maybe you'll find this illuminating. She talks about it in her new book, Muslims Don't Matter, where she says, for years she would be trying to hold her conservative government, conservative allies accountable for the rampant and multiple examples of Islamophobia that were permeating the party membership, prospective candidates at local and national government level. And she describes a dynamic whereby they would try and deflect from that by saying, well, look at the Labour Party at that time under Corbyn. Look at the Labour Party. They have a problem with anti-Semitism. Look over there. And actually, the Labour Party was doing exactly the same thing, rather than actually look at, okay, what is going on here? What can we do as anti-racists in this conversation? If Jewish leftists are talking to us about a problem with anti-Semitism, what is our response? They did exactly the same thing in reverse. Look over there. The Conservatives, look at them with their Islamophobia. They're much worse. And I'm not saying don't call out Israel for these horrendous alliances with both the far right and Christian Zionism. I'm saying we also need to be building our credibility when it comes to anti-Semitism. And that's the bit that we do not focus on as much as we should.
Rachel, thank you so much for your insights today. I want to truly honor your willingness to address these fraught topics. As you and I both know, these are not easy conversations to have. And I really appreciate you joining me today to try and tackle some of these issues head on. Frankly, I think we both care deeply about issues of equality, justice, and anti-racism, and I hope that the audience can take away from this that there's much to be taken from joining together in and hearing each other out to try and combat shared issues of concern, rather than, I think, the sort of finger pointing, which is what you were alluding to. So thank you for being a part of that.
Thanks so much.
A big thanks again to Rachel Shabi for joining us today, and of course to our viewers for watching. Until next time, let's keep the conversation going and let's keep challenging the narratives that divide us. If you enjoyed the show, please do subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Instagram and TikTok. See you next time for more tea.